Damage control party immediately extinguished the blaze and set about emergency repairs. The next strike was canceled, but the following one, against Miyako Shima, took place as scheduled at 10:30. USS St. Lo, CVE-63, was operating 60 miles east of Samar on the morning of 25 October 1944 as a part of Taffy 3, when a huge Japanese task force of 4 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 19 destroyers appeared on the horizon. Leading the Japanese force was the super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship of all time, which weighed more than all the ships of Taffy 3 combined. Taffy 3 was pitifully weak in comparison, boasting only 6 escort carriers, 4 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Nevertheless, the Americans accepted battle, and many of the escorting destroyers would valiantly sacrifice themselves to prevent the Japanese from sailing into Leyte Gulf, where the bulk of transports for the Philippines invasion was. Throughout the battle, St. Lo would avoid damage from Japanese shells. After several hours of pursuit, the confused Japanese task force reversed course and retired from battle, much to the bewilderment of the Americans. Just 90 minutes after the engagement ended with Japanese surface forces, Taffy 3 was attacked by the first organized kamikaze attack of WWII. At 10:51, an A-6M0 kamikaze dove on white planes but was hit by AA fire and turned towards St. Lo. The plane came homing in on the carrier from a low angle directly astern and crashed into the flight deck aft, its burning wreckage skidding across the flight deck, while its 500 lb bomb penetrated the flight deck to explode among rearming and refueling aircraft. A gasoline fire erupted, followed by 6 secondary explosions, including detonations of the ship's torpedo and bomb magazine. St. Lo was engulfed in flames and sank 30 minutes later. Of the 889 men aboard, 113 were killed or missing, and approximately 30 others died of their wounds. St. Lo became the first major warship to sink as the result of a kamikaze attack. USS White Plains, CVE-66, was sailing as a part of Taffy 3, about 60 miles east of Samar on 25 October 1944, when a powerful Japanese task force surprised the outnumbered and outgunned Americans. The enemy formation included the Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, armed with 18.1-inch naval rifles. Yamato opened fire at 06:59 at an estimated range of 34,544 yards, targeting White Plains with her first 4 salvos. Yamato's third salvo was a near-miss landing at 07:04. One shell from this salvo exploded beneath the turn of White Plains port bilge near frame 142, near her aft, starboard, engine room. While the ship was not struck directly, the mining effect of the underkeel explosion severely damaged her hull, deranged her starboard machinery, and tripped all of the circuit breakers in her electrical network. Prompt and effective damage control restored power and communications within 3 minutes, and she was able to remain in formation by overspeeding her port engine to compensate. Fortunately, the black smoke resulting from the sudden loss of boiler intake air pressure had convinced the crews of Yamato and Nagato they had scored a hit and subsequently shifted their fire. White Plains' 5-inch gun crew claimed 6 hits on heavy cruiser Chakai. For the next 2.5 hours, the Japanese force chased Taffy 3 southward and subjected the escort carriers and their counterattacking screen to a heavy-caliber cannonade before miraculously giving up the pursuit and retiring from the battle off Samar. The retreat by Kurita's surface force, however, did not end the ordeal for White Plains and her fellow warships. After a 90-minute respite, they suffered harassment from a different quarter. At 10:50 hours, a formation of 9 Japanese Navy Zero kamikaze planes attacked in the first organized suicide attack of the war. 2 of them singled out White Plains as their victim. Her anti-aircraft gunners responded, hitting one of the intruders, which immediately changed course and crashed into USS St. Lo, which eventually sank. The other aircraft continued on toward White Plains, but her anti-aircraft guns finally brought it down yards astern, scattering debris all over the ship's deck and sides, but causing only 11 relatively minor casualties. After the battle, White Plains was repaired and returned to service to ferry fighters to Okinawa. After the war, she participated in Operation Magic Carpet. USS Kalinin Bay, CVE-68, was steaming about 60 miles east of Samar before dawn 25 October 1944 as a part of Taffy 3, when a huge Japanese surface task force of battleships and cruisers came across the much weaker American force of escort carriers and destroyers. As the trailing ship in the escort caravan, Kalinin Bay came under intense enemy shell fire. Though partially protected by chemical smoke, a timely rain squall, and valiant counterattacks of screening destroyers and destroyer escorts, she took the first of 15 direct hits at 0750. At 17,000 yards, the Japanese battleship Haruna hit Kalinin Bay with a 14-inch, 356 Michelle, which disabled her aircraft elevator. By 0800, the heavy cruiser Haguro, which was steaming off her port quarter, closed to within 18,000 yards. Kalinin Bay responded to their straddling salvos with fire from her 5-inch gun, which only intensified the enemy fire. At 8:18, the heavy cruiser Tone joined in, and 3 8-inch 203 shells struck her within minutes of each other. At 0830, the light cruiser Yahagi and destroyers Yukikaze, Isakaze, Urikaze, and Noaki steamed over the horizon off her starboard quarter. The closing ships opened fire from about 14,500 yards, and as screening ships engaged the cruisers and laid down concealing smoke, Kalinin Bay shifted her fire, trading shots with Japan's destroyer Squadron 10. A few of their torpedoes came dangerously close to hitting Kalinin Bay before fighters destroyed them with strafing runs. However, Tone and Haguro re-engaged Kalinin Bay and closed to 10,100 yards. She took 11-inch 8-inch 203 hits from the now obscured cruisers. One shell passed through the flight deck and into the communications area, where it destroyed all the radar and radio equipment. At 0930, the enemy fleet suddenly broke off action and turned northward. Just 90 minutes after the Japanese fleet turned away, Taffy 3 came under attack from kamikaze planes. 4 diving A6M0s attacked Kalinin Bay from astern and the starboard quarter. Intense fire splashed too close aboard, but a third plane crashed into the port side of the flight deck. The fourth hit destroyed the aft port stack. Kalinin Bay suffered extensive structural damage during the morning's furious action and counted 5 dead among her 60 casualties. Following her repairs, the ship served as a replenishment carrier and eventually in Magic Carpet. USS Fanchou Bay, CVE-70, was supporting the invasion of Saipan when on 17 June 1944, when at 18:52, a Japanese bomber made a run for Fanchou Bay, dropping a 250 lb bomb as it flew 1,500 ft above the carrier. The bomb penetrated into her aft aircraft elevator and detonating within the hangar bay, some 5 ft below the flight deck. Shrapnel was launched through the hangar, instantly killing 11 men who had taken up position forward of the elevator. The blast had enough force to rupture a fire main, sever electrical cables, and even eject depth charges from the bomb bays of the Avengers stored within the hangar deck. In addition, several fires were kindled, total steering control was lost, and the ship acquired a 3 degrees list to the port. Although the fires were quickly put under control by the crew, several of her aircraft were compelled to land on other carriers as a result of the blazes. The ship suffered 14 dead and 23 wounded from the attack. Fanchou Bay retired from operations and proceeded to Pearl Harbor for a long period of repairs. She returned to duty in September. On 25 October 1944, while sailing as a component of Taffy 3 off Samar, Fancho Bay's task force came into direct contact with a much more powerful Japanese task force of several battleships and cruisers. Fancho Bay launched as many planes as possible to harry the Japanese ships while fleeing to the safe concealment of rain squalls. At 7:50, the heavy cruiser Haguro took her under aim and two 8-inch, 203 shells made impact with her hull. USS Kitkun Bay, CVE-71, had been dodging shells from Japanese cruisers off Samar on the morning of 25 October 1944, when her Task Force Taffy 3 was hit by suicide planes. One A6M0 rolled into a dive, crashed into the port catwalk and fell into the sea. The kamikaze punctured more than 100 holes in the bulkheads, doors, and gasoline lines. One man was killed and 4 were wounded. Damage was minimal, and the ship stayed in action. On 7 January 1945, the ship was targeted by a Ki-43 Oscar kamikaze at 18:57. The enemy plane crashed through the port side at the waterline amidships, tearing a hole in the ship's side approximately 20 feet long and 9 feet high. An explosion and large fire flared up simultaneously with a hit by a 5-inch round from one of the other ships, which burst close to the carrier's bow below a gun sponson, killing and wounding several men. The attack killed 16 men and wounded another 37. The ship was sent home for repairs but eventually rejoined the fight against Japan. USS Gambier Bay, CVE-73, was fired on and hit by multiple Japanese warships during the battle off Samar when the highly outgunned and outnumbered Task Force Taffy 3 was engaged by a surface group consisting of 4 battleships, including Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Yamato took Gambier Bay under fire and scored a first salvo 18.1-inch 46 cm shell hit at 22,000 yards. At 8:20, Yamato scored a hit which flooded Gambier Bay's engine room, cutting her speed to 10 knots as she began to gradually slow as Yamato followed with another 2 hits at 8:23. After taking at least 15 hits from Yamato, Gambier Bay was sinking and dead in the water as the crew began to abandon ship. The light cruiser Nishiro shelled the dying Gambier Bay as she capsized and sank at 9:11. USS Kadashan Bay, CVE-76, was operating off Luzon on 8 January 1945, when at 07:46, a Ki-43 Oscar plunged down towards the carrier. The aircraft came under heavy anti-aircraft fire, but it continued aiming directly for the carrier's bridge. Perhaps as a result of the concentrated fire, it then plunged down, striking below the bridge at the waterline, tearing a 9 FT by 17.5 FT hole, destroying the junior officers' quarters. A brief gasoline fire broke out, which was quickly put under control. A more pressing concern was flooding, which was accentuated by the ship's turn. Her gasoline system was inoperative, and her bow sank 7 FT below design specifications. Remarkably, no one was killed, and only 3 crewmen were wounded. Kadashan Bay would have to retire for repairs before finishing the war. USS Omni Bay, CVE-79, was hit by a kamikaze attack south of Mindoro, Philippine Islands, on 4 January 1945. At 17:12, a Yokosuka P-1Y penetrated the screen undetected and made for Omni Bay, approaching directly towards the ship's bow. The enemy plane's approach was partially concealed by the blinding glare of the sun. The plane sliced across the superstructure with its wing, collapsing it onto the flight deck. It then veered into her flight deck on the forward starboard side. 2 bombs were released. One of them penetrated the flight deck and detonated below, setting off a series of explosions among the fully gassed planes on the forward third of the hangar deck. The second bomb passed through the hangar deck, ruptured the fire main on the second deck, and exploded near the starboard side. Men struggling with the terrific blazes on the hangar deck soon had to abandon it because of the heavy black smoke from the burning planes and exploding .50 caliber ammunition. Destroyer escorts found it difficult to assist Omni Bay because of the intense heat, the ammunition going off, and the real possibility that a catastrophic detonation could be triggered by the blaze. At 17:45, wounded crew began to be taken off the ship, and by 17:50 the entire topside area had become untenable. In addition, the stored torpedo warheads threatened to detonate at any time. The order to abandon ship was given. Captain Young was the last man to evacuate the burning wreck. At 18:18, the torpedoes stored in the aft end of the ship finally detonated, collapsing the flight deck and launching debris onto the destroyers who were rescuing survivors. 2 crewmen from the USS Eichenberger were struck and killed by airborne debris. At 19:58, the carrier was scuttled by a torpedo from the destroyer USS Burns, taking with her 95 men. 7 survivors were killed by a kamikaze attack a few days later on USS Columbia. USS Bismarck C. CVE-95 was operating off Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands, on 21 February 1945, when her task force was hit by kamikazes. Despite the heavy gunfire, a kamikaze approached Bismarck C from the starboard side at a low angle, which the anti-aircraft guns could not depress sufficiently to fire at. The plane plowed in under the first 40 gun aft, crashing through the hangar deck and striking the ship's magazines. The fire was nearly under control when about 2 minutes later, a second plane, likely attracted by the ship's glow against the darkness, struck the aft elevator shaft, exploding on impact, killing the majority of the firefighting party and destroying the firefighting saltwater distribution system, thus preventing any further damage control. At 19:00, the crew assembled at their abandoned ship locations and the engines were cut. Captain John L. Pratt issued the order to abandon ship at 19:05. As the crew abandoned ship, a large explosion, likely from the detonation of the torpedoes within the hangar deck, rocked the ship. This explosion tore much of the aft end of the ship to shreds, and she quickly acquired a list to the starboard. At 20:07, the ship's island detached from the hull and slid into the water. 2 hours after the dual kamikaze attacks, at 21:15, Bismarck C sank with the loss of 318 men, the last U.S. Navy aircraft carrier to be lost during World War II. Heavy cruiser CA USS Pensacola, CA-24, was sailing on 29 November 1942 with TF-67 to intercept a Japanese destroyer transport force expected off Guadalcanal the next night. Just before midnight of the 30th, the American ships transited Lengo Channel and headed past Henderson Field on Guadalcanal as the Japanese task group steamed on a southerly course west of Savo Island to enter Iron Bottom Sound. In the Battle of Tassafaronga that followed, American destroyers launched torpedoes as the enemy range came within 5 miles of Pensacola's cruiser formation. Now gun flashes, tracers, and star shell candles stained the black inky darkness. Pensacola turned left to prevent collision with 2 damaged American ships ahead of her. Silhouetted by the burning American cruisers, she came into the Japanese line of fire. A torpedo from the destroyer Kawakaze hit her below the mainmast on the port side. Her engine room flooded, 3 gun turrets went out of commission, and her oil tanks ruptured to make a soaked torch of her mast. The oil-fed flames engulfed Pensacola's main deck aft where ammunition exploded. Only supreme effort and skillful damage control by her men saved the ship. The fire, punctuated by the frightful explosion of 8-inch projectiles in her No. 3 turret, gradually subsided. Pensacola made steady progress toward Chilagi. She arrived there still aflame. After 12 hours, the last fire was quenched. Her dead numbered 125 men and 67 men were wounded. She would be out of action for several months. On 17 February 1945, Pensacola was bombarding Iwo Jima when she was hit by enemy gun batteries on shore which killed 19 men and wounded 119. Despite the damage, she was temporarily repaired and resumed bombardment and counter-battery fire of enemy positions. Pensacola would finish the war and survived Operation Crossroads to be sunk as a target ship in 1948. USS Salt Lake City, CA-25, was sailing with TF-64 on the night of 11 October 1942 to intercept a Japanese resupply convoy headed for Guadalcanal. The American task force sent up a surprise ambush in the dark of night to cross the T and inflict several losses to the Japanese in the resulting Battle of Cape Esperance. During the battle, Salt Lake City fired on multiple Japanese ships, scoring many hits. Kinugasa and Salt Lake City exchanged fire with each other, each hitting the other several times, causing minor damage to Kinugasa and damaging one of Salt Lake City's boilers, reducing her speed. Salt Lake City would spend the next 4 months undergoing repairs and replenishment at Pearl Harbor. She would take part in an operation to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing their island garrisons on Attu and Kiska Islands in the Aleutians. Operating with TF-8, contact was made with Japanese ships on 26 March 1943, leading to the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, the Americans pressed their attack, hopping to get shots at transports. The enemy responded by opening fire at 20,000 yards. The ensuing battle was a retiring action on the part of the Americans, for the Japanese foiled their attempt to get to the auxiliaries. Salt Lake City received most of the attention and soon received 2 hits, one of them amidships, mortally wounding 2 men, but she responded with very accurate fire. Her rudder stops were carried away, limiting her to 10 degrees course changes. The starboard seaplane caught fire and was jettisoned. Another hit soon flooded forward compartments. Under cover of a thick smoke screen and aggressive torpedo attacks by the destroyers, the American cruisers were able to make an evasive turn, which for a while allowed the range to open. Salt Lake City soon began taking hits again, and her boiler fires died one by one. Salt water had entered the fuel oil feed lines. There was now cause for grave concern. She lay dead in the water, and the Japanese ships were closing fast. Luckily, she was hidden in the smoke, and the enemy was not aware of her plight. The destroyers charged the Japanese cruisers and began to draw the fire away from the damaged Salt Lake City. Her engineers purged the fuel lines and fired the boilers. With fresh oil supplying the fires, she built up steam and gained headway. Salt Lake City would be repaired and participated in several more campaigns in the war, earning 11 battle stars for its service. Like her sister, she was sunk as a target ship in 1948. USS Northampton, CA-26, was operating with a cruiser-destroyer force on 30 November 1942 to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing their garrison on Guadalcanal. During the Battle of Tassafaronga, Northampton, along with 4 additional cruisers and 4 destroyers, all opened fire on an unsuspecting Japanese task force of 8 destroyers. The Japanese did not return fire for several minutes as the American stunning cannonade scored many hits and sinking 1 destroyer, Takanami. The Japanese destroyers began laying a smoke screen and launched more than 45 long lance torpedoes towards the American column. 4 of the 5 American cruisers were hit by torpedoes, killing hundreds of men. Northampton was the last remaining cruiser. The rest either torpedoed or forced to turn away and turn northwest, putting her in the crosshairs of the Japanese destroyer Kajero and Makinami, which dumped their torpedoes to the port side and scored 2 hits. One hit 10 feet below the waterline abreast the after engine room, and 4 seconds later, the second hit 40 feet further aft, ripping away decks and bulkheads. The after engine room flooded. 3 of 4 shafts ceased turning, and flaming oil sprayed over the ship. She took on water rapidly and began to list. 3 hours later, as she began to sink stern first, she had to be abandoned. So orderly and controlled was the process that loss of life was surprisingly light. 50 men were killed during the battle. Most of the survivors were picked up within an hour by destroyers of Task Force 67. About 40 crewmen spent the rest of the night in 2 life rafts. USS Chester, CA-27, had been bombarding Taroa Island on 1 February 1942 when she came under heavy air attack from land-based dive bombers. The ship was hit with a 135 lb bomb in the well deck which killed 8 and wounded 38. The ship returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs. While cruising in support of the operations in the Solomons, specifically north of the New Hebrides Islands, Chester was hit by a torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-176 on the starboard side, amidships on 20 October, which killed 11 and wounded 12. She returned to Espiritu Santo under her own power for emergency repairs on 23 October. Chester would earn 11 battle stars for her service in WWII. The ship would be scrapped in 1959 after years in mothball. USS Louisville, CA-28, was operating with TF-38 on 5 January 1945 off Lingian Gulf when she was hit by a kamikaze which crashed into the No. 2 8-inch gun turret, killing 1, wounding 17, including the captain, and knocking the turret out of commission. A second kamikaze hit the ship the next day on 6 January 1945, crashing into the starboard side signal bridge and fatally injuring Rear Admiral Theodore E. Chandler, commander of Cruiser Division 4. 42 crewmen were killed and 125 wounded by the attack. Despite the damage, Louisville continued bombarding enemy positions and shot down several planes before she put in for repairs. The ship rejoined the fleet in time for the Battle of Okinawa. On 5 June 1945, she was again hit by a kamikaze, initially identified as a friendly plane. 4 twin 20 cannon opened up to set the kamikaze ablaze prior to hitting Louisville, which killed 8 sailors on a quad 40 AA gun mount, injured 45 sailors, bent the No. 1 smokestack, cut Louisville's seaplane off, and left only the pontoon on the catapult. Louisville was back on the gun line by 9 June. She survived the war to be scrapped in 1959. She was awarded 13 battle stars for her WWII service. USS Chicago, CA-29, was patrolling the waters just south of Savo Island on the night of 10 August 1942, when at 01, 43 flares dropped from Japanese planes illuminated Chicago in the dark night, giving her position away to a Japanese surface task force of 5 heavy and 2 light cruisers which had managed to sneak into firing range undetected. At 01:47, a torpedo, probably from Japanese heavy cruiser Kako, hit Chicago's bow, sending a shock wave throughout the ship that damaged the main battery director. A second torpedo hit but failed to explode, and a shell hit the cruiser's mainmast, killing 2 crewmen. Chicago steamed west for 40 minutes away from the battle to tend her torpedo damage. After repairs in San Francisco, Chicago returned to the theater of combat. On 29 January 1943, while escorting a convoy south of Guadalcanal, her task force came under repeated air attacks from Japanese G-4M and G-3M torpedo bombers in what would be known as the Battle of Rennell Island. During the attacks, 2 burning Japanese planes silhouetted the American ships, providing enough light for further torpedo runs. At 19:38, 2 hits on Chicago caused severe flooding and loss of power. The ship came to a dead stop. In pitch darkness, Louisville managed to take the crippled Chicago under tow and slowly headed south, away from the battle area, escorted by the rest of the task force. The next morning of 30 Jan, the fleet tug Navajo took over the tow job from Louisville, which was accomplished at 08:00. At 16:00, 11 G-4M torpedo bombers launched an attack on the damaged cruiser. Although sustaining several losses, the G-4M bombers managed to hit Chicago with 4 torpedoes at 16:24, 1 forward of the bridge and 3 others in her engineering spaces. Captain Ralph O. Davis gave the order to abandon ship shortly before Chicago sank stern first 20 minutes later, taking 62 of her crew with her, most of them killed by the torpedo detonations. Escorting ships rescued her 1,049 survivors. USS Houston, CA-30, and her task force were sailing to intercept a Japanese invasion convoy bound for Makassar on 4 February 1942, when she became the target of an enemy aerial bomb that put Turret 3 out of commission, killing 48 men and wounding 20. Houston subsequently sought refuge at Tjilajap to work on repairs and to tend to wounded sailors. Receiving word that the major Japanese invasion force was approaching Java protected by a formidable surface unit, Houston sailed on 26 February 1942 with a task force of one other heavy cruiser, 3 light cruisers and 10 destroyers to intercept. The Japanese force consisted of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 14 destroyers and 10 transports. Both sides sighted each other at 16:00 on 27 February and opened fire soon after closing range, marking the start of the Battle of Java Sea. Poor accuracy affected both sides, but the Allied fleet took more damage and was unable to attack the Japanese transports. At 18:00, the Allied force disengaged, having lost several ships with no success attacking the transports. After dispatching all remaining destroyers back to Surabaya, the Allied task force commander attempted to evade the Japanese escort group, but at 23:00 encountered the enemy warships again. The Allied flagship and another cruiser were sunk by torpedoes, leaving Houston and HMAS Perth alone. Both ships managed to make it to Tjilajap on 28 Feb, but were unable to resupply or refuel completely. While attempting to navigate through the Sunda Strait, the 2 cruisers ran into a Japanese invasion task force with 5 cruisers and 12 destroyers around 23:30. During the desperate battle, the 2 cruisers managed to sink and ground 4 enemy transports and inflicted damage on 4 other warships. But Houston and Perth were both severely outnumbered and fought a fierce battle at close range with the Japanese. At midnight, Perth attempted to force a way through the destroyers, but was hit by 4 torpedoes in the space of a few minutes, then subject to close-range gunfire until sinking at 02:40 on 1 March. Houston was engaged on all sides at ranges never greater than 5,000 yards, taking many hits, including a hit on the bridge which killed the captain. After being struck with 2 torpedoes, with Japanese destroyers that were firing less than 1,500 yards away with cannon and machine guns, the order to abandon ship was given. She rolled on her side and went down at 03:00 after receiving a final torpedo hit. 693 men went down with Houston, while 368 survived the sinking to become prisoners of the Japanese. 77 more of Houston's crew would die while in captivity. USS New Orleans, CA-32, was sailing on 30 November 1942 as part of a task force to interpret Japanese destroyers resupplying Guadalcanal. The 2 sides clashed in the Battle of Tassafaronga. When the flagship Minneapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes, New Orleans, next astern, was forced to sheer away to avoid collision and ran into the track of a torpedo which detonated the ship's forward magazines and gasoline tanks. The blast severed the ship's entire bow forward of Turret 2. The bow twisted to port, damaging the ship's hull as it was wrenched free by the ship's momentum, and sank immediately off the aft port quarter. Everyone in turrets 1 and 2 perished. New Orleans was forced into a reverse course to starboard and lost steering and communications. A total of 183 men were killed. With 1/4 of her length gone, slowed to 2 knots, and damage control parties managed to repair the ship enough to sail to Chalagi Harbor near daybreak on 1 December. The crew camouflaged their ship from air attack, jury-rigged a bow of coconut logs, and worked clearing away wreckage. 11 days later, New Orleans sailed stern first to avoid sinking to Sydney, Australia, arriving on 24 December while docked in Sydney. The damaged propeller was replaced and other repairs were made, including the installation